We are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short.
Hello, welcome to the Papers podcast series for the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short. I'm Jo Carlo, a freelance journalist with a specialism in psychology. In this series, we speak to authors of papers published in one of ACAM's 3 journals. These are the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, commonly known as JCPP, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health, known as CAM, and JCPP Advances. Today I'm interviewing Charlotte Viktorsson, a PhD student at the Development and Neurodiversity Lab, the Department of Psychology, Uppsala University, Uppsala, Sweden. Charlotte is the first author of the paper, Preferential Looking to Eyes versus Mouth in Early Infancy, Heritability and Link to Concurrent and Later Development, recently published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. This paper will be the focus of today's conversation. If you're a fan of our Papers podcast series, please subscribe on your preferred streaming platform, let us know how we did with a rating or review, and do share with friends and colleagues. Charlotte, thanks for joining me. Welcome. Can you start with an introduction about who you are and what you do?
Thank you for having me, first of all.
Welcome.
My name is Charlotte Viktorsson, and I'm a licensed psychologist from Finland, and I'm currently doing my PhD candidate at Uppsala University in Sweden. And I study mainly early social development in infants using eye tracking.
Okay, well, let's turn to the paper. Preferential Looking to Eyes versus Mouth in Early Infancy, Heritability and Link to Concurrent and Later Development, recently published in the JCPP. Charlotte, can you give us a brief overview of the paper to set the scene?
Of course. In this study, we used eye tracking to explore where 5-month-old infants look when they see videos of a woman either singing, talking, or smiling. And specifically, we measured the relative looking time at eyes and mouth, because these are the main areas that infants look at when they see a face. And the infants in this study were twins, meaning that we could also calculate the influence of genes and environment on the tendency to look at either the eyes or the mouth.
The primary aim of the study was to establish the relative role of genetic and environmental influences on eye preference relative to mouth preference in early infancy. Can you explain why this knowledge is important?
I think it is important because we tend to measure a lot of different behaviors and abilities in children trying to predict later outcomes. However, we still don't know very much about why infants differ in these early behaviors and abilities. And by doing a twin analysis like we did here, we actually get information about the etiology behind these differences. And by doing that, we might understand what we can do to influence these behaviors, which might be valuable information when it comes to interventions, for example. So I think this knowledge is important to further build on what we know about early infancy and how infants, through these early differences, diverge into individual pathways throughout development.
Great. What can you tell us about the methodology that you used for the study?
The sample is part of the Baby Twin Study Sweden, or BATS, which includes 622 infant twins from the Stockholm area in Sweden. And the twin analysis utilizes monozygotic or identical twins and dizygotic or non-identical twins. And the monozygotic twins share 100% of their segregating DNA, and dizygotic twins share on average 50% of their segregating DNA. And basically we want to know whether twin 1 and twin 2 in the monozygotic pairs are more similar to each other than twin 1 and twin 2 in the dizygotic pairs are. And if they are, that suggests that the behavior is influenced by genetic factors. And to do a formal twin analysis, we use the OpenMX package in R, where we can do a more advanced calculation, giving us the relative influence of both genetic and environmental factors. And for the looking behavior, we used a set of standard eye trackers, which basically is a visual formal camera that captures the gaze angle of the infants.
Great. And what were the key findings?
First of all, we found that most infants had a tendency to look at the eyes, but there were some variation where some infants tended to look more at the mouth almost all the time. This tendency to look at either the eyes or the mouth was stable across different conditions, so regardless of whether the woman was singing, talking, or just standing still and smiling. And this suggests that it is not related to low-level visual cues of the stimuli, such as a moving mouth. And secondly, we found that the tendency to look at the eyes versus the mouth was quite highly heritable. Genetic differences between individuals explained around 50 to 60% of the variation in this measure.
I want to focus on that finding that before infants can select their environment by means of crawling or walking, what they look at is largely based on their individual genotype. Can you elaborate on this? What are its implications?
Yeah, I think this is the most fascinating aspect of this study, actually, because at this age, infants cannot move around on their own, but they can choose what to look at in the environment. So they might focus on a parent's face or a bright lamp or a toy hanging above them, for example. And what you focus on will influence what you process. So this in turn might shape your learning and development and might explain the different developmental trajectories that makes us all unique. And here we show that differences in early visual preferences are to a large part due to genetics, which we did not know before. So your genotype influence what you look at 5 months of age, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, surprising actually. In your paper, you note that a preference for eyes at 5 months was positively correlated with parents' assessment of vocabulary at 14 months. What do you make of this? Because previous research shows an association between large vocabulary and a preference for looking at the mouth rather than the eyes. So that seems surprising.
This finding wasn't actually very surprising because earlier studies have found that infants at this age mainly look at the eyes of other people. So earlier studies showing the association with the mouth looked at infants in the second part of the first year. But here we look at 5-month-old infants. So here we did find that most infants had a tendency to look at the eyes, and this might be related to the emerging ability of joint attention, for example. So at around this age, infants learn to follow other people's gaze, which is known to facilitate word learning. And by following gaze, infants will attend to the same things as their caregivers, and therefore more quickly understand what they refer to when they talk about objects and events. So our findings indicate that at this early age, attending to cues relevant for joint attention might be more important for later language than attending to speech cues linked to the mouth.
In your study, in relation to mouth or eye preference, you found no significant association with later socio-communication difficulties, nor later autistic traits. Can you say a little more about this?
Yes, this is interesting since the stimuli used in this study is videos of a person, so it's therefore a quite social stimuli. However, this is a sample of typically developing infants, not infants with an elevated likelihood of autism or social difficulties. So it is possible that an association would be found in such a sample, but that is only speculative and needs to be investigated further, of course. It is also possible that this measure simply is not important for later socio-communicative abilities. And maybe it doesn't matter whether you look at the eyes or the mouth. Maybe the important thing is that you look at faces in general.
What else would you like to highlight from your paper?
I think you've covered all of the important and interesting parts, but I do like to highlight the amazing amount of work put into collecting data from 622 infants, and all of the people involved in the BAT study have done an incredible job.
How might your findings, Charlotte, inform future practice or influence the way we think about infant development?
As I said, this is one of the largest infant twin studies ever conducted. And therefore, I think that our conclusions are extremely valuable for the field of infant research. As I mentioned before, we know a lot about infant behavior on a group level, but we know almost nothing about why we see individual differences in these behaviors. Now we know that the tendency to look at the eyes versus the mouth at 5 months is highly heritable, and I think that future studies should focus on exploring the etiology of more infant behaviors and abilities and how they relate to later development.
I just want to be clear on something. So if the infant pays more attention to the eyes compared to those that pay more attention to the mouth, how does that seem to translate into later communication skills and learning?
So in this case, we did find the association with later language comprehension at 14 months. So if the more you looked at the eyes at 5 months, the higher language comprehension you had at 14 months. However, that was the only link we did find in this case with later abilities. So it does seem to be a quite independent trait, this eye-mouth index that we used.
And are there any implications for CAM professionals in terms of how this translates into practice?
At the moment, I wouldn't say that there are. This is very new research, and we don't really know if it's maybe related to even later development or maybe other traits that we haven't measured. So for now, this is new and important information for infant development, but there's no practical implications today of these findings, I think.
So where do you go next? Are you planning some follow-up research, or is there anything else in the pipeline that you can share with us?
I do have one study in review at the moment where I look at the heritability of sustained attention to faces in the same sample of twins. And in that study, we kind of zoom out from looking at specific parts of the face to analyzing gaze behavior to faces in general. So you can keep an eye out for that one.
Okay, fantastic. Charlotte, finally, what is your take-home message for our listeners?
I think my take-home message is the importance of studying these early differences in behaviors and abilities, because it might seem insignificant, but very early deviations that are very small might turn into huge differences later on in life throughout development. So I think it's very important that we do study and understand these early individual differences and of course, their relation to later outcomes.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. For more details on Charlotte Viktorsson, please visit the ACAM website, www.acam.org, and Twitter at ACAM. ACAM is spelled ACAMH. And don't forget to follow us on your preferred streaming platform. Let us know if you enjoy the podcast with a rating or review, and do share with friends and colleagues.